Manfred Raufer, I'd like to hear the story about you and your companions in detail. We have plenty of time.
As you may expect, I'm not particularly happy to share all this. I've tried to forget everything for the last 10 years. Yet I swear on my honor, I'll be truthful. I wish to release this burden.
Please, proceed then.
It began in June 44, when the Allied forces successfully landed in France, and had already taken a lot of territory from us. At the time, we were also losing our war on the Eastern Front. Ivan was hitting us hard. We already knew our fight was hopeless, but the Fuhrer stubbornly tried to save his face at our expense. We've been on Eastern Front lines for 3 years already. 3 long and horrible years. Everything was different at that point. Do you know what it's like to live day to day with a constant feeling that you're already dead to this world? Me and Ewald witnessed terrible atrocities during the withdrawal of our forces. I couldn't comprehend how they applied the principles and dignity of German soldiers. Us. I ended up in Strafbataillon, a penal company. And this is how it all started. It was only after the adrenaline rush when I realized what we had got ourselves into. As deserters, we had no future, and no home to return to. Not at least until the war ended. If at all. We were dead men walking. I lost my purpose. The dream of freeing the world from Bolshevik ideals was a lie. When I joined the Wehrmacht, I imagined myself becoming a hero. I was to be nothing but a murderer of the innocent. Ewald didn't care much where we were going. For now, he just wanted to get as far away from the Eastern Front as possible. So we traveled west, for hours on end. But for me, survival was not enough. I knew I needed to find a reason to keep going. If there's one thing you need to know about Ewald, it's that he thrived in chaos. For him, disobeying orders was as natural as breathing. He never cared much about anything. Just lived, trying to enjoy the living in his own ways. But what happened in Ponary changed him. He could no longer ignore the atrocities he had witnessed. So when Lucas asked for our help with his next mission, Ewald immediately agreed. Polish Home Army, Poland's national resistance movement, was a force to be reckoned with. Every Wehrmacht soldier knew that. The Poles were always ready, hiding and lying in wait, biding their time for the perfect moment to strike. No one underestimated them. Those who did, were already dead. We were told the Polish Home Army was one of the largest resistance movements in Europe at the time. As their newest recruits, and under the command of Lucas, we were tasked with helping them steal classified documents from a German military camp near Vilnius. We felt vindicated watching the camp burn. However, even though we proved we could be trusted, the Home Army still treated us like enemies. We were interrogated for days. The officers of the Home Army wanted to know everything. Who we were, why we deserted, and every conceivable detail about German military operations. Lucas had put in a good word for us, so eventually they let us go. Of course, not because they trusted us. We were simply another asset they could make use of. It turned out that the documents we stole contained reports of mass exterminations by the Germans of millions of Jews and Poles. What we witnessed in Ponary was just the tip of this unspeakable iceberg. I felt sick to my stomach. The Home Army wanted us to infiltrate one of the German concentration camps and gather first-hand evidence of the genocide. We were to become witnesses to the atrocities. But before I can tell you what happened next, I need to explain how we crossed paths with the so-called Silent Unseen. Trained in the United Kingdom, the Silent Unseen were elite Polish soldiers and paratroopers, well-versed in the art of covert operations. Their motto was to win your freedom or die trying. They were known as Rubble and Lead. Rubble and Lead completed their first mission on Polish soil flawlessly. They should have thought more about the consequences the assassination of Helmut Koch would have. The very same day, all hell broke loose. In an act of vengeance, the German forces randomly and indiscriminately murdered hundreds of civilians and imprisoned many more. They didn't care who paid the price for Koch's death, as long as an example was made. A display of power. And no one liked to show off their power more than them. Greta was caught during one of their roundups. She was imprisoned and would soon be tortured and interrogated. The Gestapo would make her reveal everything she knew, and then they'd kill her anyway. Getting Greta out of prison was a priority. The plan was hatched. The message was sent. Greta was ready to be rescued. I should explain how I ended up in Bialystok prison. We were halfway to the Kulmhof when we were stopped by a German patrol. Although the Home Army prepared us well for such an eventuality, we still had to be careful. It seemed like everything was going well, till Evald drew too much attention to himself. We started arguing, couldn't keep his cover story straight, and that's what made the soldiers suspicious. Then something happened that I didn't expect. They left me behind. I couldn't believe it. I was both angry and scared. I was sure I'd be killed there and then. Yet that was not the fate that awaited me. Instead, it was something far worse than death. The Gestapo, the German secret police, interrogated and tortured me. I lost track of time. The tools they used, the methods, monsters. They knew how to break a man. They would not let me die until I gave them what they wanted. When I told them, I had no choice. Yet somehow, against all odds, I was given a chance to redeem myself. As for what happened next to Evald, I didn't care about that. I was sure our paths would never cross again. You have no idea what state of mind you sink into during torture. After a time, you become an open book. The Gestapo infiltrated my mind. I wasn't exactly sure what I told them, but I was sure they had broken me. But I was given a second chance. Evald and Lucas were waiting for me. They wanted to explain what happened, but I was angry with them. They had abandoned me to save their own lives. In hindsight, I didn't realize it, but I would have done the same thing in their shoes. I explained to the others that we needed to head towards Kulmhof. Lucas was against it. He said it was too risky. He wasn't wrong. It was a suicide mission. I realized that I could not ask them to risk their lives without telling them the truth, but at the time, it was too much a risk for my own life. I couldn't stop now, so I told the group that I would go alone. To my surprise, Ned refused and said he was coming with me. Why did he decide to come alone? Looking back, I think he suspected something. We prepared our supplies, set up for Kulmhof that same day. I can hardly remember the torments I went through during the Gestapo interrogation. I told them the plans of our mission, why we were headed to Kulmhof, what we found near Vilnius, everything. However, I do not believe that things would get so very complicated. I couldn't have known that the prisoners were going to start a rebellion. From the outset, my actions only made the situation worse. Although, not everything was lost. We obtained crucial evidence and saved a key witness of these atrocious events. A man named Joachim. We escaped, and that night in the safe house, Joachim told us about himself. Before the war, he owned a factory in Munich. But after Kristallnacht, a Nazi-led pogrom against the Jews, Joachim fled to Poland. When the Germans attacked Poland, he was captured and began his miserable journey from labor to concentration camps. This is where he got in touch with the Home Army and became their inside man. After weeks of stillness and waiting for any news from the Home Army headquarters, finally something moved. Greta showed up with orders that said we were going to London. We were to give the Allies evidence of the war crimes committed by the Germans. The shortest route, straight through German airspace, was not possible. Instead, as part of Operation Wildhorn 4, me, Joachim, and Greta flew to Brindisi in Italy, and from there towards the southern border of France. At the time, preparations for Operation Dragoon were already underway. We were assured we'd be completely safe. Unfortunately, no one considered we would accidentally be mistaken as an enemy. With no radio and a catastrophic fuel leak, we had no choice but to make an emergency landing in occupied France. It was strange how peaceful life was in France, striking contrast to what was happening in occupied Poland, as if the war was going on everywhere else, except here. But the truth was, the Germans watched and controlled every single movement of its residents. Back then, I was wondering what was happening with the ones left in Poland. And with Ewald. Actually, I started to miss the bastard, I must admit. I still had hopes of meeting him and the rest of our crew after we returned from the British Isles. These hopes weren't in vain, as before we all separated, we established our meeting point, Led's family estate near Warsaw. But back to France. For months, French resistance had been formulating a plan, the aim of which was to kill several dozen German dignitaries attending a banquet at a mansion near the town. Unfortunately, in the days leading up to the banquet, the local resistance lost too many of its people for the plan to succeed. They had no choice but to seek outside help. We knew we had our own mission to accomplish, but we couldn't refuse the resistance, nor miss the chance to deal the Germans a staggering blow. I have to admit that the blink in Joachim's eye when it came to shooting these people still gives me the creeps. The mission was successful. Not wanting to wait around for the Germans' response, the French organized a flight for us to London. We were full of hope and optimism. We'd finally be able to rid ourselves of our overwhelming burden. Like in a fairy tale, where everything ends well, it couldn't have ended any other way. After all, we traveled thousands of miles, fought countless foes, embraced death many a time. Nothing could stop us. And yet, our mission was ground to a halt by petty British bureaucracy. Ironically, while we filled out one irrelevant document after another, the rest of our group was engaged in fighting a more tangible enemy elsewhere. Greta had regular contact with the Home Army. She kept us informed about what was going on in occupied Poland. She told us how Led and the others were ordered to join the Warsaw Uprising. But first, they had to break through the German-Russian front line near the city. In London, it took weeks before we were finally allowed to meet the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Although we all wanted to talk, the British only invited Joachim to the meeting. When Joachim returned, he was white as a ghost. He told us that they knew about everything, but could do nothing. They told him that the only solution was to win the entire war and bring the Nazis to justice in its aftermath. I was beyond devastated. Everything we did was for nothing. But Greta wasn't moved. Her thoughts were elsewhere, in Warsaw. The Warsaw Uprising was the largest Home Army operation in the history of occupied Poland. The inhabitants of Warsaw stood against the German oppressors. Every citizen of Warsaw wanted to help, so even the women and children fought. What they lacked in experience, they made up for with courage and hope. Besides, just like in the Paris Uprising, the Poles had hoped that the Allies would come to help them. And they believed that the approaching Red Army would join the fight as well. But the slaughter of countless Poles was in the Soviets' favor. Thanks to this, their own invasion and occupation would be less problematic. Fortunately, within the Red Army, there were those for whom the fate of the Polish insurgents could not be ignored. The Berling's army was an armed force created mainly from Polish prisoners who were previously deported to Siberia. For these people, fighting alongside the Soviets was their only hope of seeing their homeland again. Berling's soldiers managed to convince their superiors to let them join the uprising. For Stalin, they were nothing more than cannon fodder anyway. Under the cover of night, Led, with the rest of the group, and together with the soldiers from Berling's army, crossed the Vistula River and reached the western side of Warsaw. There, they joined the fight. A battle which, despite their hopes, had no chance of victory. Evald always believed he was the master of his own fate, and that the world was his personal playground. His sacrifice was so unlike him, yet his courage was so unmistakably Evald. The uprising was defeated. Tens of thousands of young people sacrificed their lives in that hopeless fight, achieving absolutely nothing. At Hitler's personal request, Warsaw was razed to the ground as a warning to other German-occupied countries who thought of resisting the Führer's might. The defeat of the uprising was an unintentional gift for Stalin. Any Polish resistance the Soviets might face had been crushed by German hands. We finally managed to return to occupied Poland. Some time back, we agreed that upon our return, we were all to meet at Led's family estate. It had been a long time for all of us, and our disagreements didn't matter at this point. Somehow it was good to drown our sorrows together. A moment of peace. The question on everyone's mind was, what next? For my Polish friends, the war was still raging. The Soviets were just another invader whom they'd have to fight. For Joachim, it was quite the opposite. To him, the Soviets were the ones who defeated the oppressors of his kinsmen. Joachim suddenly stood up with a glass of vodka in his hand and made a toast to the so-called Soviet liberation. Led violently disagreed. Greta told us that Led's whole family was murdered by Russians. A similar fate awaited thousands of other Poles. The only thing that changed for them was the color of the tyrant's uniform. Joachim left in anger. There was too much going on for me that night, so I decided to go for a walk to get some fresh air. Some time passed, when suddenly a convoy of trucks barreled into the courtyard. It was the NKVD. They stormed out of their vehicles and ran inside. I helplessly watched them take my companions prisoner. How did they find out about us? How did they know we were here? Only we knew about Led's estate. I owed these people so much. I had to find a way to help them, as I knew they would be executed. Just like any Polish partisan captured by the NKVD. They were most likely headed to a prison compound in Warsaw, commonly known as Toledo. This was to be my last assignment. And this time, it was completely personal.
So, 5 of you escaped the NKVD. And what then?
Then we separated. Each of us had a different idea of what happens next. Besides, it was easier not to attract any attention being alone. We promised ourselves we would meet again, But that never happened. After I fled to the US, I managed to handle myself in the new reality. Nonetheless, I spent the last years trying to find out how my friends were doing. Evald never got his own tombstone. His corpse was never identified. I felt bonded to the guy. This is how sharing suffering works on people. The thought I would never be able to drink to his tombstone, it still hurts today.
And this Greta lady?
Greta, stubborn and proud as she always was, stayed in Poland and continued to work in conspiracy. In '46, after the war ended, she was recognized as an AK vet and imprisoned. I've been told she refused to sign the forged statement according to which her commanders were collaborating with Germans. Sentenced to death in a ridiculous trial. Executed shortly after. Frankly, I miss her attitude. She was a great person. Leonard, Led, well, after he got better, he went into the forests with other partisans to continue fighting the Soviet occupation. Just a week after his group was compromised and eradicated, his trace appears in England. One of his silent, unseen companions told me that Led became some sort of mercenary and went into Africa. No idea what happened next, and where he's at nowadays.
What about this Lithuanian?
Lucas? He was eager to go back to Vilnius, but Led managed to convince him to keep fighting. Based on what I found out in England, it's most probably went with Led there. But I don't think he's become a mercenary. If he's still alive, he's probably smuggling something somewhere.
And this Rubble man?
Rubble went back to Lvov City back in '45. I think he wanted to rebuild things, but after Yalta, the USSR decided the city was no longer Polish, making it part of the new Ukrainian state. Rubble, along with all Poles from Lvov, was deported to the Western Poland territories, which were previously German. He ended up in Silesia, working as a miner. Replaced Evald, you might say. He's still alive, as far as I know.
Any regrets on Joachim?
Nah. He got what he deserved, right?
Mr. Raffa, I think you should take this story to Hollywood.
No, I don't want people to know I was in the Wehrmacht. And besides, here nobody gives a shit about the Eastern Front. Like the Iron Curtain was shut and nobody cares about what happened in that part of the world. And I saw it all. And I see how Soviets are lying about things today. Can I get my prescription now?
Of course, of course. I hope you're feeling better after sharing.
Yes. I think I do feel better.
We may finish for today. So, see you in 2 weeks, as usual?
Yep, as usual. Do I feel better?
So, 5 of you escaped the NKVD. And what then?
Then we separated. It was much easier to move around the occupied territories alone than in a group. And each of us had their own expectations. I managed to flee to the US. For several years, I tried to build a new life, but At some point, I just had to start looking for what was happening to my friends. I made some progress, but suddenly, you people appeared on my doorstep and brought me here.
Alicia Hetman, known as Greta. What do you know about her story after you separated?
She continued to work in conspiracy. But after 45, and after Yalta, when it became obvious that Poland stayed occupied, she managed to flee to the west. The most probable version I've heard is that she became an anti-communist activist in France. I believe France needs such people nowadays, huh?
Let's stick to the facts. What about Leonard Sokolovsky, aka Led?
Last time I spoke to him, after he recovered a bit, he was eager to continue fighting. Found his place in an active and relentless AK cell. I never heard about him again, but I do believe he's still hiding in the forest, making Soviet lives harder.
What about Lucas Yanis, the Lithuanian?
Lucas. He told us he was going back to Vilnius to work something out. The only thing I found out he managed to work out was a Soviet bullet in the head. He joined his friends. Probably just as almost every AK soldier I've met.
Jan Guzevich. Do you have any information about this man?
He was the only one of my companions I met when I managed to travel to Poland 2 years ago. He was a mess. He couldn't go back to his beloved Lvov, as after Yalta it was handed over to the Ukraine. He talked a lot, but I saw the man was dying. Last year I got a telegram from his family that Jan drank himself to death.
And Ewald Faber died in Warsaw. You sure about this?
Yes, I am sure. My friend saw it happen. Ewald never got his tombstone.
Ewald!
His corpse was never identified, but I'm sure he died. Otherwise, I'd do everything to speak to my friend again and reconcile.
Fine, Mr. Rafa. That's all we need to know right now.
You never asked about Joachim. And honestly, I have an impression he's the reason I've been brought here.
Your speculations do not concern this court. Take the defendant back to his cell. Considering all your sincerity, after hearing witnesses, this court was able to find humanity in you, Mr. Rafa. In our eyes, you redeemed yourself. Therefore, we proclaim you not guilty.